Welcome to part 2 of Macromolecules. If you did not listen to part 1, I highly recommend listening to that before you listen to this lecture. So the only other thing that I wanted to say about nucleic acids is that the bond between the nucleotide is called a phosphodiester bond, and you'll want to know that. You can also study this slide. The PowerPoint is on my Ozarka. And I would like for you to study this slide and this information in your book about base pairing. Okay, so moving on to the next class. This is the third one in the list, carbohydrates. The carbohydrates are used for energy storage and as structural molecules. So that's the function that you're looking for carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates are made up of one or two monomers, and complex carbohydrates are long polymers of monosaccharides. So for this type of macromolecule, the monomer is called a monosaccharide, mono meaning one, saccharide meaning sugar. And then the polymers are called polysaccharides, many sugars. So an example of a monosaccharide would be glucose. A disaccharide just means two sugars. It contains two monosaccharides. The example here is sucrose, which is formed by joining together a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule. So complex carbohydrates are long chains of monosaccharides called polysaccharides. And here's the word down here, polysaccharide. Okay, so in plants, starch is used, the polysaccharide starch is used for energy storage. And in animals, the equivalent is glycogen. And I'd like for you to know that. And so those are the energy storage polysaccharides. There are other polysaccharides that are found in different kingdoms that are structural. And so, and these are actually hard to break down, like cellulose, which is why a lot of the plants that we eat or vegetables we eat are fibrous. Cellulose is a polysaccharide that makes up the cell walls in plants. Another structural polysaccharide is called chitin, and chitin is a structural polysaccharide found in the exoskeletons of insects as well as the cell walls of fungi. So this table, you can just look at this table in your book if you wish. I'm not going to say anything about it today. And then the one other thing that I did want to point out about carbohydrates is that the link between the bond between the monomers or between the monosaccharides is called a glycosidic linkage. Moving on to the last category of macromolecules. The last category is lipids. And if you remember from the beginning of part 1 of this lecture, lipids are the oddball group. They're put together in a way that is different from the other ones. The other three groups had subunits called monomers, and a whole bunch of them are put together into a chain called a polymer. Well, lipids, they do have subunits, but it's not the same as with the first three categories, and I'll explain that in a minute. But I wanted to point out the function of lipids. So lipids are used for energy storage, and then the other use for lipids or other function of lipids is that phospholipids are the main components of cell membranes in both eukaryotes and prokaryotes. And lipids in general are nonpolar, meaning that they don't mix with water. So if you think of lipids as being fats, you can think of oil and water, how they don't mix. And so most lipids are at least going to have some portion of the molecule that is nonpolar or hydrophobic. Okay, so fats are used for long-term energy storage. The scientific name for a fat is a triglyceride. And so the fats are made up of two different things. They're made up of one glycerol molecule and three fatty acids. So glycerol is a 3-carbon atom, and it attaches to 3 fatty acid chains. And each spot where a fatty acid chain is connected to one of the carbon atoms in glycerol is a bond called an ester bond, or an ester linkage, is formed through a dehydration synthesis reaction. So lipids do have that in common, that a dehydration synthesis reaction puts them together. So this is a picture of a triglyceride, and so this would be your glycerol molecule, and then these chains of bluish and white atoms are the fatty acid chains. And this is another one. This would be an unsaturated fat, and we can talk about that too. So fatty acids, you've all heard probably or read on nutritional labels about saturated fats versus unsaturated fats, and unsaturated fats are healthier, more heart healthy than saturated fats in general. But I'm going to explain the difference between the two. This figure shows it too. So a saturated fat, well, let me start back. A hydrocarbon chain, or a fatty acid, is made up of lots of carbons and hydrogens. It's a carbon attached to a carbon, attached to a carbon, attached to a carbon, and then carbons can make 4 bonds. So on this type of straight chain in a saturated fat, each carbon atom that's in the middle of the chain is gonna have a hydrogen, 2 hydrogens connected to it. And that is known as a saturated fat because it has the maximum number of hydrogens. And so saturated fats, the fatty acid chains in saturated fats, all of the bonds between the carbon atoms in the chain are single bonds. And so you have the maximum number of hydrogens, each carbon attached to 2 hydrogens. And so saturated fats, because of that, the chains, or the fatty acid chains, are very straight, and that allows them to pack together really tightly. And so they would be hard or solid at room temperature because they can pack together really tightly. So in contrast, an unsaturated fat means that there are fewer than the maximum number of hydrogen atoms attached. And why this happens is that sometimes in unsaturated fats, you have one or more places in the fatty acid chain where there are double bonds between carbon atoms. And so since carbon can make 4 bonds, if you have a spot where you have a double bonded carbon atom, or a double bond between carbon atoms, each of those carbon atoms is going to have 1 hydrogen atom bonded to it instead of 2. And so that's why it's called unsaturated. But what that does is it causes the fatty acid chain to bend or kink. And so when you have fatty acid chains that aren't straight, like in the saturated fats, it means that the molecules don't pack together as tightly. So those types of fats are liquid at room temperature, and an example is olive oil. It's an unsaturated fat. So moving on from triglycerides or fats to phospholipids. Phospholipids make up the 2 layers of plasma membranes or cell membranes. They're often called a phospholipid bilayer or a lipid bilayer. And you can look at this figure from your book. It's just showing the 2 layers of a plasma membrane and how they're made up of phospholipids. And so one thing that I wanted to point out about phospholipids is that they're made up of a phosphate atom, or a phosphate molecule, connected to 2 fatty acid chains. Those are the tails. The phosphate side of the molecule is polar or hydrophilic, while the fatty acid chains, or the tails, are hydrophobic. And so what happens is these molecules self-assemble or naturally assemble into a phospholipid bilayer, because in environments where cells are, the solution outside of them is aqueous or water containing, and there's also aqueous or water containing solution inside. So what happens is that the hydrophobic tails of the phospholipids are attracted to each other and repelled by water, so they turn to the inside of the plasma membrane, and the phosphate heads are hydrophilic or polar, and they are attracted to the water or the aqueous solution. So you end up with this nice plasma membrane, and the main function of the plasma membrane is that it's a selectively permeable barrier around cells. The last type of lipid, and I'm going to want you to know the three types, is steroids. Those are steroids. Cholesterol is an example. And cholesterol, the function is that it's embedded within plasma membranes or cell membranes, and it helps for them to stay fluid and not become hard and rigid. So this concludes the discussion on macromolecules. Please refer to your book for more detailed information, and you're welcome to contact me with any questions you might have. Thank you so much.